So we're going to talk about what is a freight broker, which is the most important thing for you to know if you're considering becoming a freight broker. So what is a freight broker? What does a freight broker do? Who utilizes freight brokers? And why do they utilize freight brokers? What's the purpose? And then finally, how much money can you make as a freight broker realistically? Let's jump in. A freight broker is a middleman. And so as middlemen, we never actually take physical possession of the freight. So even if your customer is the shipper or the receiver, it doesn't matter. We don't own any assets being trucks, so we never pick up or deliver the freight. We offer a service. And so instead, we will have these relationships with carriers to be able to facilitate the move for the customer. More on that in just a second, but let me give you a quick example. Let's say that a customer has a load that goes from Atlanta and is trying to get up to Washington, D.C. The customer would then call us and say, hey, can you facilitate this move for me? They're not going to say, hey, could you facilitate this move for me? They're going to say, hey, I need a truck. Can you get me a truck? That's what they're going to say. And so it is our job to be able to go out, find that carrier, contract them to do this run, and then that's how we make our money. So we're going to jump into that in just a bit on the breakdown of that. How do we make money as brokers? But how do we actually find our trucks? Well, we do this by utilizing two things. Number one is going to be carrier relationships that we've built up over years and years and years. And I'm talking about any brokerage. You know, it takes a really long time to build up carrier relationships. And so every single day we're adding tons and tons of new carriers because we keep growing. And so, you know, for customers, that's pretty hard. The second way that we can do this is by posting uploads and utilizing different software to be able to find carriers. So again, why though? Right? Why use brokers? So now we understand how a broker does it for the most part, very general, okay? But we understand that a broker finds carriers, utilizes current carriers that they have relationships with to be able to facilitate the moves. But what are the benefits of using a broker instead of going straight to the carrier themselves? Well, that carrier base that took a long time, like I was talking to you guys about building, you know, took years and years to build and is continually growing, is because there's a vast amount of customers contributing to the need. Okay, if you have one customer that does even a good steady amount of freight, it's very hard to build a carrier base on one customer for the long term. And let me explain why. If you do a lane all the time, then yes, you can find carriers that can help with that one lane. But the longer the lane, the harder it is to find carriers to be able to do it on a regular basis. The reason why is a carrier could pick something up in Atlanta and then go up to Washington, D.C. like we talked about, but they're not going to be around the next day in Atlanta, right? To be able to do it again, or maybe even the next day. And so one thing to really remember here is that carriers follow the money. These are over-the-road carriers, and then you have local carriers. So over-the-road carriers would go up to Washington, D.C. from Atlanta, and then the next load that they took could go anywhere. They follow the money, what's going to pay them the most. And so you might also think, well, it should pay the same thing going back to Atlanta, right? No, absolutely not. So every single lane is going to pay different depending on the market conditions at that time. So for example, you might make $2,000 going from Atlanta up to DC, right? But going back might only pay $1,500. You never know. And I'm not giving you guys real numbers right now. We're just spitballing, but you know, that is the difference in market conditions. Not every lane is equal. So the exception to this would be shorter local runs. A customer can find a carrier that does really short local runs because of course they can do them every single day. And so that doesn't really bother us as brokers though, because to be honest, we need miles to make money, and the short runs just really don't interest us at all. We can't make a living off of short runs. For the most part, a significant living is very hard to be made off of short runs unless you have a ton of volume. So the second benefit of using a broker is liability. And so when I say liability, I don't mean, hey, the broker's going to take all the liability off of the customer, even though it sounds like that a lot of times, and customers sometimes think that. The carrier is still the one who is primarily responsible for the freight. So everything has to go through their insurance first, and then can be filed under a broker's insurance as contingent, which we talk about a lot. But that's how that works. So the carrier is still primarily responsible for the shipment, and the broker might not be responsible for it at all, to be honest. So sometimes customers have a false sense of security there, but they shouldn't necessarily, because what the broker is able to bring, if they do the job right, is an extra safety blanket. And so what happens is, and what should happen anyway, is that the broker, before assigning any carrier, does their due diligence, does a background check on the carrier, looks up any kind of freight guard reports or anything like that on the carrier, looks at how long they've been in business, how many assets they have as far as trucks go, how many drivers go, their driving history, their records, and then makes a good decision on whether or not to assign that carrier to a load. And so as a brokerage, we have the subscriptions and software and tools to be able to utilize to be able to be picky with the carriers that we pick, where customers aren't going to have those things. There's no reason for them to have them. There's no reason to have the post boards either, because it's just more and more money for no reason when, we talk about this in a second, but there's a lot to this, and they have other things to do. So let's talk about that a little bit. The time and hassle that comes into actually doing this job. So remember, your customer already has a job. That is shipping manager and dividing up this freight and making sure that, brokers have what they need to be able to do their jobs. But it is not their job. And so there is a ton that goes into this. Check calls, delays, any type of communication. Remember, our service is customer service. That's our product, is customer service. And so we need to make sure that we are communicating to our customers at all times, anytime something is wrong or even right, so that they know that we're staying on top of the shipment. It is a full-time job. If a truck falls off, you have to recover it. If something happens, then you need to find a warehouse. There's so many moving parts to logistics that it is a full-time job, and it's not your customer's job. That is what we are here for. Which brings me to my final one, which is relationships. And so we talked a little bit about warehousing. Not every move is so simple as point A to point B. Sometimes you need multiple trucks. Sometimes you need it to go into a container. Sometimes you need rail. There's a lot that can happen. Sometimes you'll get a breakdown on a reefer and you need to find a cold storage. So keep that in mind. The relationships that you have aren't just with the carriers, but it's with warehousing, transloading facilities, cold storage facilities, the ports, the railroads, all the different ramps. And so all of those come into play, especially when you get into some container freight. So now finally, how does a broker make money? In order for us to make money, we need to have a spread. That's all we need. It's just a spread. We have what we charge versus what we're going to pay a carrier, and the spread is going to be our margin. So let's revisit the example that we went through earlier where you had Atlanta going up to DC. So if I were to charge a customer $2,000 to go from Atlanta, Georgia to Washington, DC, and then I went out and I found a carrier for, let's say, $1,700, that is going to give me a $300 margin. And then your commission is off that $300. That's our spread. And so that is how brokers make money. They simply charge X amount, pay a carrier Y amount, and make the difference. So that's a lot like any type of product or service. And remember, our product is our customer service. So we need to make sure that we're always doing a really good job. You can't charge a lot of money if you're not worth it. That's something to think of. Also, whenever you're going after different things, you'll start to learn that different commodities require different amounts of attention. And so you'll be able to make a little bit more money on certain commodities than others. So some businesses, they operate on a flat dollar amount, right? So they'll say, hey, any of our services, it's an extra $200 on top of whatever we pay or whatever the case may be, right? Brokerages don't typically operate this way. I don't know any that actually do. Maybe they do exist, I don't know. But typically, and to my knowledge, all the ones that I've seen are not as transparent with it. It's just, hey, we are charging $1,000 and we're going to pay 800. The reason why, you have to understand this too, is the reason why they'd be going a lot back and forth. And so when a customer reaches out to us and they ask us to do a move, they're not asking us, they're not awarding us that load first. They're going to ask for a quote, and they're going to compare that to other brokers. So if I gave a quote of $1,000 and I was able to find a truck for $800, sure, that'd be $200. But if I was able to find a truck once for $700, well, it's still going to be $1,000 to the customer because it's too much to go back and forth. And next time you might need all 1,000 to get that run done. Remember, carriers are ever moving, and you're always going to find different ones and be able to utilize different ones. And you don't know how far away that carrier is from the shipment. If a carrier is 100 miles away, obviously the deadhead that they have is going to upcharge just a little bit because their cost is more. So keep that in mind. So how much money can I make as a broker? That's the question that everybody really likes to ask, is just what's the most I can make? And honestly, technically, the correct answer is an infinite amount. There are no commission caps almost anywhere in business now. I don't know a single job that has commission caps. It's a sales job, but there's definitely none in the brokerage side or things here at League. And so, yeah, the real answer to that is there's no limit. However, don't let that make you think that everybody makes $1 million. That's not how it is. So we have to look at realistically. Realistically, how much money can you make? I would say realistically, you should be making six figures in year 2. I think that's a little bit of a stretch in year 1, but by year 2, you should be making six figures. I think that's very realistic. And then, after the ones who are successful, by the way, most people won't be successful as freight brokers. So if you're thinking it's easy, yeah, it's pretty simple, I guess. It's not easy. It's not an easy job. And it's actually not even a very simple job once you get into container freight and moving parts, besides just point A to point B. The Atlanta to DC move that I gave you, that would be a simple one. But it's not an easy job. Most people aren't going to be successful at it because historically speaking, most people haven't been successfully at it in the industry, just the industry as a whole. Freight brokerage is a very hard thing to be successful at. It takes a lot of ambition and determination and execution. You can't just want it, you got to do it. So I'm not going to give you a pep talk here. But I will say that after a few years, if you're still a freight broker after a few years, you should be doing quite well. Upwards of 250 is something that is definitely reasonable. All right, so I hope that was a pretty good introduction as far as what a freight broker is and who needs us, right? Pretty brief, but who needs us, who really can utilize us, not necessarily the exact type of businesses, but just know that about 95% or more of businesses actually utilize freight brokers. So it's a huge, huge market. And then also, we went over what you can make as a freight broker, what's realistic and what's not. So if you are still interested in becoming a freight broker, go on to the next one.